Courtney Bublé joins us now. Courtney is a reporter for Government Executive. She's a reporter that gets in there and asks the tough questions, reports that back, and isn't afraid to talk about the issues of the day. We asked her on because of the transition and the transition of power between the Biden administration that's about to begin and the Trump administration that we just went through, that we just had. Courtney, good to have you on Down the Road.
Thanks for having me.
Talk to me about it. Grade this. How is the transition going so far?
Well, I'll first start by saying that the transition process began almost a year ago. The GSA launched their transition directory in November of 2019, and there's been certain milestones that the administration and the candidates have had to meet over the past, particularly 6 months. So up until the election, the General Services Administration, Office of Management and Budget, and other agencies involved have met all their deadlines, and transition laws have evolved over the last 20 years or so that have given the presidential candidate more support of the election. So they met all of those pre-election requirements. But now we're sort of in a waiting period because in order for the transition to officially begin, the General Services Administration has to ascertain the election, which is essentially the fancy word for giving it the green light. So the Biden people can get access to over $9 million of funds, go into agencies, kind of get the lay of the land. Granted, this might be virtual because of the coronavirus, but still, and get briefing books. So we're waiting on that to happen. There's been a lot of different calls on GSA for this to happen. Granted, the Biden team is doing their own planning and they're working as much as they can until that happens. But GSA does need to ascertain the election before it can begin in earnest.
What is GSA?
GSA is the General Services Administration. They oversee government contracting, government real estate, and the presidential transition is one of the many things it does. And in most years, it doesn't get much attention. This was a big issue in 2000, but since then, it's kind of one of those bureaucratic procedures that flies under the radar. But this year, it's become national news because of the president's lawsuits and the recounts and the question of when the administrator, Emily Murphy, who was a political appointee, is going to do this.
So when you talk about that, and you said they kicked in over a year ago, so that's like an insurance policy in case administrations change.
Exactly.
Right? Because if the Trump administration has won, most of that work would have been thrown out the window.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there are some that argue a transition should occur even if it's the same president because they can, renew their policies and bring in new personnel. But a transition really just happens if there is a new president. And after the 2000 election, where there was the recount and the Supreme Court case where we had a significant delay in getting results, and then the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which were about a year later, there was a need for more legislation and more support for the candidate ahead of the election because the 9/11 Commission identified this as a vulnerable time in our country where we could be susceptible to foreign attacks. Also, too, like with 2000, where we had this waiting period, the Bush people couldn't go into agencies and they didn't have the luxury of the run-up that candidates now have.
So, with cabinet members, oftentimes they're asked to give their resignation even if an administration wins. Donald Trump goes through cabinet members like somebody with a cold goes through Kleenex. I mean, the fourth Secretary of Defense just got fired. So we know that, and we know transition is needed between those things. But now with the Biden administration, the information that he would get from President Trump, much of that information, I suspect, would not be information that we as the general public would ever know. But I'm curious what your comment is about that.
No, that's a totally valid point. And there's been multiple reports over the last few days about how the Defense Department and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence will not engage with the Biden team until GSA ascertains the election. Granted, that's part of the law, but they're even saying we can't do anything. Our hands are tied until this happens. And, I don't want to speculate too much, but, that could become an issue if GSA takes a while to give this green light, especially with having, an acting defense secretary now. Foreign adversaries could be looking at that and seeing that, we're in a vulnerable time in our country.
Well, here's a time in history. I want to make sure that people understand that all things aren't like we're talking about right now. I mean, George H.W. Bush, the transition that he had And what he did for the Clinton administration, I think, is a perfect example of what should happen for the good of the country. In fact, it's the perfect example. You leave a letter in the desk of the Oval Office saying, you know what, for the good of the country, even though they were opponents in the race, for the good of the country, here's what needs to happen. And I think that conversation I think it was just nothing but class by George H.W. Bush, which leads me to this question. What if Donald Trump doesn't quit? What if he never concedes?
That is the million-dollar question. And as someone who's been covering that transition for about a year now, my biggest question is, are we going to have a repeat of 2016 and 2017 when there are all those reports of the Trump administration not engaging with the Obama people, ripping up briefing books, and just kind of upending this procedure that has been decades in the making? So who really knows what's going to happen? The president was tweeting today, you got to count every vote, we're going to win, ballot fraud, all these baseless claims about voter fraud. So I honestly don't know what's going to happen. See,
people I think a lot of people think that the time between the election and the inaugural is plenty of time to get all this done. But it's a short period of time in a government world. I mean, it really is. And we're already looking, between the lawsuits and everything else that goes with it, we're looking now at December during a pandemic. I mean, timing-wise, how's this going to work, Courtney?
Yeah, that's another good question. Also, too, we have to take into account that government funding runs out on December 11th. So if we have a government shutdown, that could just throw everything into even more chaos, which I don't know if it's going to happen. And the pandemic definitely makes things difficult. The Biden transition team does have space in the Commerce Department. That's part of one of the laws that has evolved over the years. But they've been working predominantly remote. They don't want to put staff at risk if they don't have to. And it's not a long time. And granted, the Biden team has been doing work for a while now, getting their policy priorities and reviewing regulations and whatnot and just doing everything they can. But we're 71 days from inauguration, which is on January 20th. And in the scheme of things, that's really not a lot of time.
71 days. And keep in mind that some of those days are weekends and some of those days are holidays. And there's a Christmas and a New Year's involved in all of that. So what it's going to take is somebody quitting. And we know who that person is that's most likely to quit. Now, whether or not he's a generous is the wrong word. Whether or not he's like George H.W. Bush is yet to be determined. But I will tell you this, there's a lot of people out there that believe on the Republican side as well, that at some point you got to concede the election.
Yeah, one would think, but I think covering this administration, if I've learned anything, it's that it's very unprecedented and we kind of don't know what's going to happen, the next day. And the president and his base are very convinced that he won and that there is fraud. I just gonna have to wait and see.
As an American taxpayer, as somebody who has had a lot of family in the military, heck, my father fought in World War II. I can tell you this, the things that I'm never going to know as a citizen a lot of that is based upon the military. A lot of that, of course, is based upon the Secretary of State. In the minute that we have left, what happens if he doesn't tell them about those things? What happens if he doesn't tell him, for example, like Obama did about North Korea? I mean, what happens, Courtney? I've got 30 seconds left. You tell me. You solve the problem.
I think that we should have faith in our military and that they're going to do the right thing and that they're going to tell the Biden administration what they need. That would be my prediction because that seems to be an enduring characteristic.
I'd believe you more if there wasn't 4 defense secretaries that all happened and one just got canned.
I'm trying to be optimistic.
Courtney, where do they find your work? Tell them.
You can find my work at govexec.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Courtney Bublé.
Courtney, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on with us.